taking place across Canada. Seth is the former director of our British Columbia office, and we are super excited to help him get the word out about his latest masterpiece. Before we start our program, I want to recognize our many co-sponsors who helped make this evening happen. They are among the leading progressive organizations in Canada, and we really want to thank them for supporting this event and helping to get the word out. So in alphabetical order, I want to say thanks to the Atkinson Foundation, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, the Canadian Union of Public Employees Ontario, the Centre for Policy Innovation and Public Engagement at Ryerson University, Climate Action Network Canada, the Corporate Mapping Project, the Council of Canadians, the David Suzuki Foundation, ECW Press, the publisher of this fantastic book, Environmental Defense, Greenpeace Canada, The Leap, 350.org Canada, and the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. All of these organizations are excited about Seth's book, and for good reason. Bill McKibben from 350.org has called it a truly great book. Science journalist Zaya Tong, who also just happens to be our host tonight, has called it the blueprint for rapid societal transformation that we have all been waiting for. Former Kirk of the Privy Council, Alex Himmelfarb, calls it exactly what we need right now, and I couldn't agree more. I can see now we've got a good number of people online, so let's get started with the program. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our host tonight. Zaya Tong is an accomplished journalist, a committed environmental activist, and a successful author. She has too many credits to name here, so I'll just say Zaya was the longtime co-host of the Daily Planet for Discovery Channel. After 8 years at WWF Canada, she recently joined the board of the World Wildlife Fund International, and last year, she published The Reality Bubble, a fantastic dive into the world around us that many of us don't see, but scientists do. Zaya will be steering our conversation tonight and helping all of us dive into Seth's book. So without further ado, here's Zaya.
Thank you so very much, Erica. It is really exciting to be here tonight, and I can see online there are so many people joining us already, so welcome everybody. And I want to start by giving everyone just a bit of an overview of what's going to happen tonight. In a little moment, I'm going to be calling on Bronson Black. He's from the Georgian Bay Native Friendship Center, and he's going to be kicking things off with a welcome for all of us. And following that, we're going to have a musical performance by the one and only Sarah Harmer. And then after Sarah's song, we're going to hear from Seth, and he's going to tell us all about the book. So when he's done his presentation, I'm going to kick off a bit of a Q&A, and we're going to open that up to you guys at home as well. After that, we will have three very special guests. I'm going to introduce them in a little while. I'll say for now that they're all very accomplished activists, and they are going to be answering a really critical question for all of us here tonight, and that is, what are the next steps in the climate mobilization right here in Ontario? After that, we're going to have another short Q&A, and we're going to open that up to you at home as well again. And then to close out the evening, we're going to be hearing from Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, one of the terrific researchers at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, about the CCPA's own really great work around the climate emergency. In terms of just basic housekeeping and the interface and some logistics here, on this Zoom call, you'll see at the bottom, there's a chat function. So we're going to be sending you guys some links about the climate emergency, some research, some work, and also information on where to buy Seth's book. And it's available in print as an ebook and as an audiobook. I have to tell you, I blurbed this book, and as a fellow author, it is truly a powerful, important, and critical work. I cannot recommend it enough. So there's many different options for you to pick it up. Don't feel like you have to take notes as we're going through this, because we will be emailing all of you links afterwards, so you can just sit back and enjoy the conversation. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can use the chat function and let one of us know, and you can also use the chat function for the Q&A portion, so you can just ask some questions there, and hopefully we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can. Lastly, this is all being recorded for posterity, and the way it's working is the people who are on the screen are actually going to be in the record function. So if you're sitting at home in your pajamas and you haven't done your hair, you do not have to worry about that at all tonight. Okay, so that's it. We are ready to go. I'd like to now introduce Bronson Black for our Indigenous welcome. Bronson is from Port McNicoll, Ontario, and he works with the urban Indigenous population through his position as the Kije Anishinaabe Neen Coordinator at the Georgian Bay Native Friendship Center in Barrie. The aim of Kije is to end violence against Indigenous women and to promote an understanding of respect and care for one another through sharing traditional teachings, roles, and values. And he's had many great friends, teachers, and elders support his journey of learning the traditional teachings of his Métis and Ojibwe heritage. So over to you, Bronson.
Hello. Ani, bonjour, webske mangan diskas, pomnikel donchaba, wapske dodem. My name is Bronson Black. Thank you, Zai, for introducing me. I don't think there's anything I can add myself. Just as we go into this event together, I'd just like to take this time to acknowledge grandmother and grandfather spirits, ask that they help move us through our day with open minds and open hearts, say miigwech them for the work that they do and the support that they provide as we pursue that minnow bamadzwin, that good life. I'd like to say miigwech, or thank you, and bring attention to all the four-legged, two-legged, winged ones and those who swim for supporting our way of life and sustaining us over the years and all the teachings they bring us. I'd like to acknowledge that the land we're meeting on today, this is Indigenous land, and it has been inhabited by First Nations for thousands of years before colonization. Say miigwech to them for the work that they've done being the stewards of this land and preserving the natural environment for all those generations that have come after. I'd like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, the Anishinaabe, the Mohawk, Mississaugas, Wendat, and Métis of this area and all other nations that have inhabited Ontario. I would like to take a moment to appreciate the 7 generations before us, all the experiences that they went through to bring us where we are today and preserving that culture and preserving our land. I'd like to take a moment to think of those next 7 generations and think of what we need to do to preserve this land and preserve our environment for them so that they can enjoy the privileges that we have to be able to go out and a walk in the woods and to see the animals and natural environments. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Creator for another beautiful day, ask them to look after all those missing, murdered Indigenous women, help them give us guidance to work towards truth and reconciliation, to walk in a good path and a good way. I'd like to give acknowledgements to all those who work so hard on this event, all those people behind the scenes that we don't get to see who bring us here today. Big shout out to Seth Klein for his book and bringing more attention to the work that needs to be done to climate change. In our culture, we're taught that this earth is a gift to us and all gifts come with responsibility. And as beautiful as this is, it's our responsibility to take care of this earth and all that inhabit it. And we have many gifts and many strengths that give us that capability. It's just coming back together for that one goal of protecting this earth and being the stewards of that land and getting back to that singular thought. Rapid change needs to take place, and I think Seth Klein really captures that in what he writes and what he speaks about. So I'd like to say miigwech to them and miigwech to everybody who's in attendance, who gets his book, who reads about it, who shares this mindset of wanting to move forward as one. I wish you all a great day. Have good health and safe travels. Miigwech.
Thank you, Bronson, for such a kind and warm welcome to everybody. Now, our next guest needs no introduction unless you don't have radio or Spotify or ears. She is a passionate activist, a platinum-selling recording artist, and of course, a Canadian national treasure. It is our great pleasure to introduce Sarah Harmer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's great to be here. The song is called New Low. I wanna ride this feeling into the night. I wanna see how far. Nights are fleeting, you know they are. I wanna see if we can take this from flame to fire. Heat is fleeting, but hearts are beating hard. Out in the street 3 times this week. New threats, new lows. If this gets us to our feet and grows, who knows? Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Hey, did you stand on sidelines? I didn't show up. How did you sleep so long? How many hours till doubt moves on? And while we wait in our house slippers and read about the war, boiling over, coming under the door, out in the street 3 times this week. New threats, new lows. If this gets us to our feet and grows, who knows? Ba 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 ba. New lows. Ba 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 ba. We'll rise to new heights. Look at your feet, it's a gray area. Somewhere in the fine print buried deep, it's a gray area. Where all the excuses come to meet, it's a gray area. Schools betting on fossil fuel, black and white. Out in the street 3 times this week. New threats, new lows. If this gets us to our feet and grows, who knows?
Thanks. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's incredible to have a front row seat at your concert here today. That was wonderful and inspiring. Thank you. I'd like to hand the floor back over to Erica Shaker now, Director of the National Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and she's going to introduce tonight's guest of honor. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much, Zaya. Thank you, Bronson, for just a beautiful welcome, and to Sarah for that absolutely wonderful gift to all of us. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to do this next part, which is to introduce a former coworker and longtime friend, colleague, and fellow traveler. Seth founded the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives just before I actually began my job at the national office as director of the education project, which was longer ago than I care to admit. I met Seth for the first time shortly after that at a staff retreat. He was lovely and gracious and incredibly competent. Some might say scarily impressive, except again, he's so lovely and gracious and interested in learning from everyone he meets, which of course comes across in his approach to everything he takes on: thoughtful, painstakingly researched, and extremely well executed. This book, which Alex Himmelfarb glowingly proclaimed a game changer, is case in point. Seth has, of course, moved on from his role with the BC office of the CCPA, but at the national office, we've just recently had the pleasure of his company and his advice over the past few months while he was researching and writing his book. And what was so clear was how much he loved immersing himself in this new area of research, engaging with it, and then making it accessible and so very present at such a key moment. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce Seth Klein, who we miss very much, but are so proud and excited to watch him continue to do the work and fight for the changes that benefit us all, while slaying a few neoliberal and climate change denier dragons along the way. So Seth, my friend, congratulations on this amazing and timely endeavor, and over to you.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Erica. That was lovely. And thank you all so much for attending. It's of course disappointing not to be doing this in person, but it's thrilling to know that you're all here. This is my first book, so getting it out in the world is of course nerve-wracking, but I'm really grateful to feel your enthusiasm over the ether. If I may, I just also want to start with some thank yous. First, I too want to acknowledge and express my gratitude that while you are all over the province on the lands of many Indigenous nations, I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you, Bronson, for that lovely welcome. I realize land acknowledgements for a virtual event may be a little odd, but as I argue in the book, the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title is central to winning this existential fight. And the chapter on Indigenous leadership in this climate mobilization is actually one of my favorite. Second, thanks to all the organizations that have co-sponsored tonight's event. I'm not going to name them all again. Please look at their names and links in the chat. But I do want to say a special thanks to my former colleagues at the CCPA, my longtime home, for taking on being the lead host for this event. The CCPA folks are the people with whom so many of the ideas in my book were developed, and they've been so supportive of this effort, and I'm deeply grateful. The third, thank you so much, Sarah. for that fabulous musical opener. I was keen to open with music like that. By the way, I have a link to that song on my website. And not just because it's a good way to begin, you know, touching our hearts as well as our heads, but also because it was my hope that we could profile some climate emergency music like that. One of the chapters in the book deals with how to rally the public. And like every chapter, it starts with lessons from the Second World War. And in the war, arts and entertainment played a crucial role in mobilizing the public. World War II had a popular soundtrack. This climate emergency moment, not yet, but our hope with all the musical openers on this virtual tour is to start to seed what that soundtrack might be. So thank you, Sarah, for kicking us off. And finally, my thanks to the organizations who provided me with funding to undertake this book project: the McConnell Foundation, the Medcalf Foundation, the Corporate Mapping Project, the David Suzuki Foundation, the BC Teachers Federation, and SFU's Urban Studies program. So, okay, with that done, let me offer some opening comments about the book. I hope and think that my book makes an important contribution to this moment, that it calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one we've pursued to date. And while I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, I also hope and believe that you will find it an unusually hopeful book. This is the book, by the way, in case you haven't managed to get it yourselves. So as the title suggests, I am convinced that to confront the climate emergency, a wartime approach is needed, and moreover, that our wartime experience should be embraced as a hopeful story. Now, there's no small irony in me coming to this place. Like many of you, I'm sure, I wrestle with this war analogy. I cut my political teeth in the peace movement. I'm the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's why I'm Canadian. But I now strongly am of the view that the climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society, galvanize our politics, and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why. I'm gonna screen share and show you a chart, if I may. There. This is a CCPA event after all, so we got to show you a chart, right? Despite decades of calls to action, our greenhouse gas emissions are simply not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. What the chart shows is our GHG emissions going back 20 years. And what's evident is that in the face of the defining challenge of our time, our politics are not rising to the task at hand. And I just want to invite us to let this deeply disturbing chart sink in, and then let us all agree that what we have been doing is simply not working. We have run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, and where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. Now, you might look at a chart like this and think, well, at least things have more or less flatlined. But as the great climate change warrior and founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben, has said, winning slowly on climate is just another way of losing. Our politics might be all about compromise and the art of the possible, but there is no bargaining with the laws of nature. And the laws of nature are now telling us something fierce. Here in my province, we had a nice day today, but it was the first time in a while, all last week, because of the horror unfolding to the south of us. We were engulfed in flames. And just as we sent, in smoke, I should say, and as we're all sending our children back to school and had been assured that the windows would be open and the kids would be outside, our crises converged and we were ordered to stay inside and shut the windows. So a new approach is needed. We need a wartime mindset and a political and policy agenda to tackle the climate emergency. It's my view that we need a good war. So let me just, I'll keep my opening comments brief. The book project began as an exploration of how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we must urgently do. And it is that. I'd always planned to include a chapter on lessons from the Second World War for rapid mobilization. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from Canada's Second World War experience. Not because I get all weirdly animated about war, rather it's because I see in the history of our wartime experience a helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat, And in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of a few short years. So the book explores what wartime scale mobilization could actually mean and look like. Each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did during the war and what we now face. And in the comparisons, it answers questions like, how was public opinion rallied to support mobilization during the war, and how could it be galvanized again today? What was the role of government, news media, arts and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class, race, and gender, and how can we do so again? How is national unity established across Canada's many provinces? And can we successfully do that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we collectively transform our economy and marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? And how can we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the necessary finances once again? What supports were offered to returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war? And what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth in social movements then and now? Importantly, what are the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the response to refugees that we don't want to repeat? And critically, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? I'll share one important comparison I make right near the beginning because it gives me some hope, and it's this. Despite Canada's declaration in September of 1939, declaration of war, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by our Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And that's where we find ourselves today, in this awkward period where last summer, Justin Trudeau's government will pass a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and the very next day, reapprove the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. That's the new climate denialism at play, a concept I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, I believe this phony war is not going to last. I'm convinced it's about to end. The book is an invitation, really, to our political leaders to reflect on the leaders who saw us through the Second World War and to consider who they want to be and how they wish to be remembered as we undertake this defining task of our lives. My hope is that the book might embolden them to be more politically daring than we've seen to date, because that's what this moment demands. And much like the trials that tested the character of past generations, the book is also an invitation to all of us to reflect on who we want to be as we together confront this crisis. The first chapter, just to give you a teaser, shares what I see as some of the key lessons from the Second World War, which I dubbed the battle plan for climate mobilization, a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. Much of the book deals with the connections between climate action and inequality and argues for why linking these crises is central to winning. And I'll conclude my opening with this. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety for the state of the world we're leaving our kids and those who will live out through most of this century. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight. But it's worth appreciating that those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, likewise, didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. And yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process, surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving. That, I think, is the spirit we need today. So Zai, I'm happy to talk with you more about the book now.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And also very capable of rebuilding. I'm often reminded of that when I think of my grandfather's generation and the rubble that they all came from in the world that we have today. So, of course, everybody has been reviewing this book. People have been saying it's a timely book, that it's an urgent book. So you mentioned our political leaders earlier. Why do you think that they've been reluctant to act on this like a real, true climate emergency? Why are they like that dog in that flaming house sipping the cup of coffee saying everything is fine while everything is on fire?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few reasons. One is the curse of the climate crisis, unlike the pandemic and unlike the war, is that it moves in slow motion. And so that allows for some of this stalling. Secondly, I think so many of our political leaders falsely assume that the public isn't ready yet. I interviewed many politicians and political insiders for the book, and in one way or another, so often they fell back on this line, you got to meet the public where they're at, and they're not there yet. And I actually think they're wrong. The polling I commissioned from Abacus as part of the book's research really reveals a public that is ahead of our politics when it comes to this. But another important factor is just what I call the new climate denialism, this moment we're in, kind of like the phony war at the beginning of World War II, where our politicians say they get it, but don't really get it. And I also think part of this is the legacy of neoliberalism that has sapped our imagination and our ambition. Why don't our governments invest the way they need to and spend the way they need to? Why aren't they regulating the changes that we actually need? Why aren't they creating a new generation of crown corporations to actually lead this change the way C.D. Howe did during the war? The answer is they don't think that way anymore. That's the legacy of neoliberalism. But not to end on a negative note on this question, what I would point out is the same paralysis existed with the Mackenzie King government in the Depression, right? They couldn't see, we didn't have a New Deal in Canada the way they did in the States because the Mackenzie King government couldn't imagine that until the war. And then it all went out the window, just like we've seen in this pandemic.
So what we are looking for now is that, that imagination to return to our politicians. The other thing, though, I kind of wanted to ask you about is something I think that most of us encounter daily on the internet, and that is climate deniers, whether they're people on your Twitter feed or they are people on the news. So when I saw Tucker Carlson recently on Fox, the skies in California were blood red for the second time in 2020. And he is calling this a liberal agenda. So I kind of want to get your perspective on, quote unquote, the other side. Do you believe that we need to spend a lot of time or activity in convincing these people or not?
So I would say, there's this, what I call the traditional climate denialism, a la Donald Trump and Maxime Bernier, who just deny the reality of it. The good news, and it comes across in the polling I commissioned for the book, is that it is really a diminishing rump of Canadian public opinion. And I don't think it's the main thing that we're up against. I'm happy that some people, do their best to go after these folks and do some myth busting, and more power to them. But I think that our larger challenge is what I call, and really the people who I had in my head when I was writing the book are the people who practice the new climate denialism. And what I mean by the new climate denialism is, and it's true of our federal government, it's true of the BC government where I am, it was true for the NDP government in Alberta, governments who say they get it, but don't practice a politics and policy that aligns with the science. That's what I mean by the new climate denialism. And it manifests in a federal government that says they get it and then doubles down on the expansion of the oil sands. In my province, it manifests in a province that has a Clean BC climate plan, the most ambitious in the country, and doubles down on fracking and LNG expansion. And just to give you one illustration of it, so in the book, I really laud the ramp up of this extraordinary ramp up of military production that happened in the war under the auspices of this guy, C.D. Howe, the Minister for Everything, he was called. And he was no lefty, right? He was like on the right of the Liberal Party. He'd made a lot of money in business, but he was an engineer in a hurry. And in the course of the war, he created 28 crown corporations in order to expedite that production. Justin Trudeau's government to date has created 2 crown corporations, one of which, is the one that makes us all proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline. When we have yet to see what it looks like when this government actually gets the emergency.
Right, and I want to ask you some questions about the idea of crown corporations in a little bit, but before I get to that, the climate movement itself is not monolithic. I think we all know that, and it's fractured in different ways. And right now we're seeing some people suggesting that people just need to focus on the climate and not necessarily perhaps distract with social justice. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there is definitely this group of climate policy purists, you might call them, or some of the policy wonks out there in climate land who basically make an argument like, please don't mix this up with inequality and social justice. This issue is hard enough as it is. Don't weigh it down with that stuff. And I respectfully think they're wrong.
I also agree with you very much.
And the book spends some time on why. So first of all, you can't separate them because these issues are deeply intertwined. Lower income and more vulnerable people in Canada and around the world are suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis. On the flip side, the richer you are, the higher your emissions. And runaway income inequality is associated with runaway emissions. And it's also connected because most climate actions, which we need to take, increase energy prices, and those hit lower income people harder. So that's not a reason not to do it. It means we have to be doing it eyes wide open and mitigating it. But the main reason I think they're wrong is because by linking these issues is actually how we win. Let me give you some examples. In the polling that I was mentioning, I found very strong support for bold climate action across the country. But then I also asked, well, how would your support go up or down if the government tackled this by increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, by offering a good jobs guarantee to fossil fuel workers, by increasing income transfers to lower income households to help? When you do that, support for bold climate action doesn't go down. It goes through the roof. This is the appeal of the Green New Deal, that when you actually link the inequality stuff with the climate stuff, support actually gets dramatically higher than support for any political party. But just to bring this back to the war, I'm like that uncle who's always bringing it back to the war now. But that happened too. So it was during the Second World War. The King government actually recognized that if hundreds of thousands of people were going to voluntarily enlist, he had to tackle inequality. He had to prevent the profiteering that had marked both the First World War, but also has stained the pandemic reality in the last few months, right? Profiteering like that was made illegal during the war. They increased taxes on the wealthy and corporations. The first two major social programs of Canada happened in the war. Unemployment insurance in 1940, the family allowance in 1944. In fact, the Marsh Report, which was really the architecture for the whole modern Canadian welfare state, was written during the war, because the government realized at a certain point, if they were going to get people to sign up, it wasn't enough to say to people, go get Hitler. They actually had to make a promise to them about what kind of society they were going to come back to. We have to do that too.
And that's what I really love about your book. Again, that it doesn't just have a lot of historical anecdotes. It's actually backed by a lot of data, which gives me that appeals to my internal nerdiness quite a lot. So of course you write a lot about the wartime mindset. So what I'm wondering is, how about the scope and speed of what was actually accomplished at that time? Can you tell us a little bit or walk us through that?
Yeah, this was digging in. This was what amazed me in the research was, as you say, the scope and speed of what was accomplished. So first of all, appreciate for a moment, there was basically nothing in the way of military production in Canada before World War II. We were a small country of a little over 11 million people. And in the space of those 6 years, we produced about 750 ships, 16,000 military aircraft, producing ultimately the fourth largest air force in the world, 800,000 military vehicles, more than Japan, Italy, and Germany combined. That gives you a flavor for the scope of it. And you had C.D. Howe not only creating new crown corporations, but actually coordinating all the input chains, supply chains for all the key inputs, whether it's rubber, silk, timber, coal, fuel, all of it carefully coordinated to prioritize military production. And that to me is the model. We need to do what he did again. We need to take an inventory of what are we going to need? How many electric buses? How many electric heat pumps? How many solar arrays? How many wind turbines? And then set about ensuring that the production is there to do it. Thinking about a new generation of crown corporations to scale that up and to deploy it. to use that military language again. That's just a flavor of the speed and scale of what happened.
So if you were to choose, some crown corporations or some areas where you think that the government should get going, what would you choose?
So actually, I have about I have like a 3 or 4 page list of what new generation crown corporations in the book. But just to give you, well, here's one example, for example. So I recently went through the process in my home of getting the natural gas out of the house and replacing our system with electric heat pumps. And it was expensive. And it was more expensive than it needed to be. And more complicated than it needed to be. I would love to see our crown utilities actually create a new subsidiary for the mass production and deployment of electric heat pumps.
Mm-hmm.
Get the profit margin out, get the economies of scale. They could make it thousands of dollars less expensive to actually do this at a mass level. This is where, when I showed you that chart of so little progress, I think part of why we've seen so little progress, and it speaks to that neoliberal mindset, almost everything that's happened so far on climate, federally and provincially, is voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we give a rebate. That's not emergency. In an emergency, you actually tell people you have to do it by this date, and you create the economic institutions that you need to actually ensure that those targets are hit.
Terrific. I could actually see I can see the chats as they're popping up, and somebody said, electrify the postal fleet.
Yes, well, that's a great model. And there's already this great campaign that the LEAP and the postal workers are involved in. That's a model for every existing crown corporation to rethink their whole operations in a way that's serious about the emergency.
Absolutely. And you guys feel free to start sending in some questions for Seth. I've just got a couple more before we head into some of yours. And just as a side riff, I think you and I had mentioned this briefly. I really think that in terms of a crown corporation, what the government should focus on is cellular agriculture, because that's where the science is moving, being able to produce meats and proteins anywhere, whether it's up in the high Arctic, you could produce milk or, beef or chicken without the actual animal, which of course reduces a lot of the land impacts, the methane, all those sorts of things, the water. So there's lots of exciting.
Actually, if I may on that, I think that's a splendid idea. And I believe, because I was told he registered, but one of the first people to talk about the comparison of using the model of the war for climate mobilization was Professor Dennis Bartels from Memorial University, who I think is on this. I think he's one of our attendees. And he proposed something like you just said, Zaya, a crown corporation around plant-based protein and figuring that out. I would add to that and say, we need a crown corporation to help the whole agricultural sector transition with
100%.
non-fossil fuel machinery and so on.
It's exciting, right? It's hopeful. I love that it's, gives us a space for these new ideas. So I'm going to take a question right now, and a few more will keep coming, but we have one from the chat that says, Seth, if neoliberal capitalism is a central part of the challenge, how can we begin to address something so monolithic?
So here's the thing. That you'll see, I hope, in the argument I laid out. There's, of course, my sister has long looked at this challenge of how do you make the climate emergency work under capitalism. I'm taking a slightly different tack. I think neoliberalism is incompatible with climate emergency, and the kind of growth that we've come to expect is incompatible, and the kind of consumerism is incompatible. But the interesting thing about the World War II story is that the private sector did have a big role to play. The difference is the private sector wasn't allowed to determine the allocation of scarce resources, because that's not what you do in an emergency. It takes a kind of planning. That's what C.D. Howe did, and that's what we're going to have to do again if we're going to do this in time.
Great answer. Okay, another question has come in. What are some things that communities and individuals can push for? For example, heading into the next round of elections, what should voters be pushing for?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question. And whether it's provincial or federal, big picture, we have to demand that our governments start to show that they get that this is an emergency. And helpfully, you know, my book was premised on the notion that we needed this historic reminder, but we've all gotten a reminder in the last few months under the pandemic. Oh yes, this is what emergency looks and sounds and feels like. You know, it's daily briefings, it's emergency measures when required, it's special cabinet committees to coordinate your efforts, it's, you know, it's coordinating supply chains as needed to get produce what you need produced. I think I would say this is an important question, actually, and we need to judge the throne speech on this and what comes next in the next federal budget. The first thing is we need to see an emergency mindset, and the clearest indication of that is that we have to shift gears from voluntary measures to mandates and clear regulatory mandates about what now has to happen. You know, if a community in the interior of your province is facing a forest fire, we don't say to that community, we encourage you to leave. We say, you got to go. That's how you know it's an emergency. The other piece is that you spend what it takes to win. And again, we've seen this in the pandemic, right? After being told for years, there's no money, there's no money, there's no money, poof, there's $300 billion in the space of a few months. And the Bank of Canada playing this extraordinary role, buying, that we haven't seen since the war, by the way, buying $5 billion in government securities a week. The cat's out of the bag, having seen that. They've just shown what was possible all along, and we need that level of spending. We would, as I said before, see the creation of new economic institutions like crown corporations that show that you get it. You'd see a level of economic planning, as I was getting out before. And I would mention, I know this is an Ontario audience, but we need to see a real offer to places like Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. And I recommend there be a new federal transfer called the Climate Emergency Just Transition Transfer that's big and audacious, so that people in places like Newfoundland, in like Alberta, which is responsible for 38% of our emissions, and where people are understandably anxious, instead of just transition being some vague, often hollow promise, it's real money, real investments on the table, showing people that what we're prepared to do.
Great. We'll have time for just a couple more questions. I'm going to sneak another one of mine in there, though. So I work in the media, and let me tell you, Seth, it has been a struggle. It is a struggle. I have talked to executives all my life to try and get this out there. And I understand what some of the issues are. I understand that when people come home at 5 o'clock at night and they've been in the rat race, the last thing they want to do is turn on the tube and see a lot more doom. But heck, like there's really very little mention. I think even Greta tweeted about it the other day. It's abysmal, the amount of discussion there is on climate change, and the Overton window really needs to start shifting. But anyway, That's my rant. What do you think the role is of the media in the climate mobilization?
Well, there's a huge and vital role for media, and you're absolutely right. It needs to be a heck of a lot better than we've seen to date. Just by way of showing how poorly the job has been done. I mean, I mentioned in the polling I did, the good news is people get that there's an emergency and they want to see action, but the level of basic climate literacy in our country is abysmal. Only about half of the public understand that the principal source of global warming is the combustion of fossil fuels. So we got a lot of work to do. And as you just mentioned from Greta's tweet, the failure to connect the dots between extreme weather events, which I think we should call attacks on our soil, and climate change, and giving us a sense of agency. But again, there's this fabulous story out of the war about the role of the media. The American media on CBS played a huge role in shifting public opinion there towards engagement in the war over a 2-year period. And you know, we all want media that's factual and that's science-based, but my argument is, you know, because they often say, oh, well, we need balance and all of this. You know, in the face of a global civilizational threat, you should pick a damn side. and our media should pick a side, and then provide the best factual information they can. In the war, you mentioned you don't want doom on the news. In the Second World War in Canada, fortunately, the CBC had been created just a few years before the war, and the nightly newsreader was a guy named Lorne Greene, who went on to become a famous Hollywood actor. Some people might remember him from Bonanza, or if you're a child of the 70s like me, he was the original commander of Dama in Battlestar Galactica. Fabulous, deep voice. In the Second World War, he was known as the voice of doom, and everyone gathered around their radios to get the nightly update. Where is our nightly update? And one last thing on this point, it's the advertising too. And I talk about the fact that we get mixed messages from our governments. We also get it from the media. I don't know why advertisements from fossil fuel cars and gas stations aren't illegal. We don't allow it for tobacco, but if you're a person or a young person and you're told it's a climate emergency, but you still see these ads, that's a very confusing mixed message, and I don't know why we allow it.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's such a good point. If anything, we should tax those ads.
That's true. Well.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I think I've got time for just one last question from the audience before we move into another panel. The question for you, Seth, is in the Second World War, Canadians knew what the goal was, to defeat Hitler and his allies, and they knew what winning was. In the climate emergency, what is the goal for Canada and the world, and what counts as winning?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think we actually have a fair amount of clarity. I mean, and it's improved in the last couple of years. I think the publication of the IPCC report 2 years ago provided some of that clarity. We need to follow those targets. We need to reduce our emissions in Canada by at least half in the next 10 years. And we need to get to zero by 2050 at the latest, if not 2040. So we have that roadmap, and we have clarity that means effectively electrifying everything and ensuring that electricity is no longer produced by way of fossil fuels. So that's what winning looks like at our end. But I also think, there is this sense you often encounter, particularly among Canadians, like, oh, we're just little and it's just little us, and what difference does it really make? And I like to point out, the same was true in World War II. We were even smaller then, less than a third the size we are now. And for a couple of years, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere that actually was in the war. And come the end of it, nobody questioned the value and importance of our contributions. So again, I think that's the spirit we need.
Wonderful, indeed. Thank you so very much for some terrific answers. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a break now, Seth, and we're going to hear from our next panel. We've got some great climate activists, and the topic that we're moving on to next is, what does the next stage of climate mobilization look like right here in Ontario? So I'm going to introduce all three panelists first, and then each of them is going to have about 5 minutes to speak, and then we're going to open up the conversation again to everybody at home. So I'm going to just introduce all three of our panelists. Yannick Beaudoin is Director General for Ontario and Northern Canada with the David Suzuki Foundation, and he brings an economics for transition lens to his work, facilitating conversations in Canada and around the world that highlight pathways to a socially thriving and ecologically sustainable Canada, what we all want. Cecilia La Rose is a 16-year-old Arawak climate activist based in Toronto. She's been working and organizing global climate strikes, and most recently is a youth litigant on the La Rose versus Her Majesty the Queen climate case launched against the Canadian federal government for its inaction and active contribution to the climate crisis. I would like to raise a hand to you, Cecilia. Amara Possian is the Canada Campaigns Manager at 350.org and a Government Relations Professor at Seneca College. During the 2019 federal election, she managed Our Time, the youth-led campaign to elect Green New Deal champions. She is passionate about developing leaders to tackle climate change, racism, and inequality. So Amara, let's start with you. The question is, what does the next stage of climate mobilization look like here in Ontario?
Thanks, Aya, and thank you for having me, Seth. Lately I've been thinking a bit about the days leading up to the lockdown in March, so I kind of want to start there. On March 9th, I was at a Green New Deal reception on Parliament Hill, and I stood at the front of the room and I read out the mandate letter from our generation, which is the letter that our time organizers delivered to newly elected MPs by occupying the chamber of the House of Commons just 1 week after the 2019 election. And even after 2019, which was a massive year for the climate movement, a year where millions of people took to the streets for the historic climate strikes, I remember looking out at the room and sensing what Seth calls the new climate denialism. I was looking around and I wasn't, quite sure that every MP and staffer in the room was actually going to go back to their office and act as though this is an emergency. And then a couple of days after that, I was back home in Toronto, and it became clear to me and to many of us that we were about to enter a shutdown. And as I started to fear that we too might need permits to leave our neighborhoods soon, I started to worry. We were entering uncertain times, a time when we would surely need each other. We were in an emergency, and I realized I didn't really know any of my neighbors. So on the evening of March 12th, I stood in this exact same room that I'm in right now, feeling really anxious and really unsure about what was to come. And what I decided to do in that moment was drop off notes at my neighbors' houses. I figured that I wanted them to know that I could help. So I did that. And then the next day, the only thing I could think about was how close I came to not dropping off the notes. What if it was weird? Or what if nobody called me? Or what if too many people called me? And what I decided to do was to post that note on social media in case anybody else was feeling the same way. I figured maybe seeing a template would be the push that people needed to actually do something. And then things exploded. People started responding to say that they did the same thing. Seth's partner, actually, Christine, tweeted that she and Seth dropped off notes to their neighbors. So neighbors called, they offered to help, they asked for help. A few of us from across the country who had never met each other before put together a toolkit. We organized ourselves on Slack to share tips. I could not have anticipated how much more would be possible in the days to come because of one small action that I took on that day. And the reason that I keep thinking back to this week before the lockdown is that in an emergency, climate change, pandemic, both, we have a choice. We can freeze, we can carry on as if it isn't happening, we can say one thing and do another, or we can dive in and try to help, even if we aren't sure about the outcome. And that is the kind of moment that we are in right now. We are in an emergency. We're facing uncertainty. We're in a moment where we know what needs to be done. Seth has very eloquently given us a roadmap. But what needs to be done is so big and so transformative that maybe deep down we aren't sure it's possible. Or maybe some of you are on this call and you're thinking, how could I possibly help with something that big? But the thing is that if there is one thing that the last few months have shown us, it is that we have no idea what's to come, and that every single one of us has a role to play in taking care of each other, and that an emergency response definitely is possible. We have done it before. We are doing it right now. It is totally possible. And so the question before us is whether or not we are going to come together and make it happen. So when we're looking at what comes next in Ontario, I think there are two things we need to do. The first, and always, we need to organize our communities. One of the most powerful things that every single one of you can do is to ask yourself, who are my people? Who can I reach? And then bring those people together and organize them to do something, anything, but make sure that you're doing it together. Are you a part of a tenants group? Are you a part of a parents group? Do you work in the service industry? Do you work in the fossil fuel industry? Are you a teacher? Call a meeting. Ask yourselves, can you do something to help transform your industry? Can you talk to people and bring the public on side? Figure out what you can do together and do it. And secondly, if we are going to tackle the climate crisis at the scale and the scope and the speed that is necessary, We are going to need people in office who want to and who actually can marshal the resources to make it happen. During last year's Our Time campaign, we ran a grassroots process to endorse Green New Deal champions. But we didn't just ask candidates if they supported a Green New Deal. We asked them how they would use their power. Would they work across party lines? Would they organize other MPs? Would they stand up to the leader's office when needed? And it was definitely going to be needed. Would they work with communities, and how would they do that? The thing about our political systems is that they are set up to centralize power and to entrench the status quo. So we need people in office who are going to take risks. We need brave people who will do things differently. And here in Ontario, I kind of freak out every time I think about this, but we have 3 critical elections coming up in the next 2 years. In 2022, there's the Ontario election and the municipal election, and it is almost certain that we will have a federal election before then. The people that we elect in those elections are going to inherit a closing window to tackle the climate emergency. So we have to make sure that they are the kind of people who don't just show up at a Green New Deal reception, but show up with a bold plan and a plan to implement their plan. So put your time and your money into making sure that bold leaders get elected. Run for office, recruit people to run for office. We all know what needs to be done. Just a few months ago, I had no idea what was going to happen when I dropped off those notes at my neighbor's doors. Earlier tonight, Seth talked about how those who rallied against fascism 80 years ago had no idea if they were going to win. We were all surprised by what we achieved. We can all be surprised. We will be surprised by what we achieve. So whether you are organizing your community or you are running for office, be brave and find that one thing that you can do together that makes even more possible tomorrow. Thanks.
So inspiring and so true, Amara, because you're right. How do we mobilize if we don't connect first? So I love that. And it does start with small steps. Wonderful. So I'm sure some people will have some questions for you afterwards, but right now, Cecilia, same question over to you. What does the next stage of climate mobilization look like in Ontario from your perspective?
So, what does the future of climate action look like in Ontario? Needless to say, that's a pretty complicated question. I don't think that there's really an easy answer, but to start, you need to look at the history of climate action here in Ontario and on a national level. For a long time, we've approached environmentalism and climate policy with a mindset of reasonability, often settling for policy that's only marginally better than what existed before, and hoping that slowly we can continue to improve on it. This just hasn't worked. As much as our climate policy may have evolved, the impact it's had on our GHG emissions has been minimal. This method of a painfully slow approach doesn't work, and the past decades have made that abundantly clear. Canadian GHG emissions have not radically declined, despite the introduction of new climate policies, such as the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change and the 2016 Paris Agreement. With the current state of the climate crisis, we need to be seeing bigger changes in our emissions in order to keep the Earth's temperature from rising. So what does the future look like? It involves a dramatic change in how we organize and what we organize for. The climate movement needs to diversify and work towards justice for people and the planet. Approaching environmentalism with a justice perspective that recognizes the intersectionality of the effects of climate change. And as we work towards bold climate action, we need to stop allowing politicians to use climate change as a political weapon, politicizing climate change and environmental considerations. The attachment of climate policy to specific political parties and the distractions and wasted energy taken when we focus on fake green policies and pick fights with each other are only delaying meaningful climate action. Young people recognize climate change is politically bipartisan. We, even though we can't vote, want to inherit a political system where all political parties recognize the necessity of urgent climate action. Having policy that meets the scientific requirements to stop climate change is the bare minimum. The involvement of young people in the climate movement is a needed change. We bring a sense of urgency. We have frustration with the old way of approaching things, but we have the energy and the courage to change it. Young people are sick of politicians insisting that they're doing enough, that they're committed to fighting climate change when their actions so clearly say differently. Patience for this form of politics is quickly disappearing. I believe that with the presence of young people in climate advocacy, our methods of action will change. As more young people become eligible to vote, politicians from across the political spectrum have felt the pressure to adjust their stance on climate change accordingly. While these shifts may not be near enough, they still represent a changing voting base for all parties. We as young people are less tied to traditional politics, and we are more willing to accept and want radical climate policy. Young people are the consumers and producers of popular culture globally. Our recognition of the need for urgent change and the prioritizing of climate action can be infectious. Our use of social media, our influence to change popular opinions, and our ability to build cultural movements need to be harnessed for powerful climate action. It is also worth noting that in the fight for climate justice, we should not be only viewing it as political. The recent wave of climate lawsuits centering on the rights of young and marginalized people are a reminder that lives are being impacted by climate change today, and further contribution to the crisis will only make this worse. With cases such as the La Rose versus Her Majesty the Queen in Canada, the Beaudoin case in the United States, and state and provincial cases in both countries, climate lawsuits now exist in many countries around the world, and it represents a shift in how we're viewing climate action. Young people will have to live through the worsening effects of climate change. Many of us already experience them today. Climate change is no longer in the distant future, and the continuation of a business as usual attitude with the knowledge that people will suffer is truly criminal. The future of climate action is a cultural shift to recognizing climate change as the emergency that it is, fundamentally changing our mindset towards the climate crisis and expanding our view of what climate action looks like offers us a lot of hope for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for your bravery. And I can see Seth clapping even though he's on mute, so you won't see him doing it because his face won't pop up on the screen yet. But yeah, I also saw some people in the chat, people saying, making suggestions like general strike, suggestions like lowering the voting age to 16. And I know you've got a lot of people rooting for you in your court case. So moving on now to Yannick, if you would like to take on the question. And again, just as a reminder, it is, what does the next stage of climate mobilization look like in Ontario?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you, Seth, and everybody for the invitation. I just moved back to Canada about 2 years ago. And just to let you know, Seth, you're the first Canadian author I've read since I've come back. So it's been really a privilege to get this book and put some ideas together. I think building on what Amara and Cecilia started, I was also part of the caremongering as soon as the whole caremongering movement that started during the crisis, and it got me to think and reflect on everything that is possible when we realize what truly is meaningful to us during a time of crisis. What is really, really valuable really shows up, especially when systems are really disrupted. So I kind of came up with, I'm a kind of a systems economist, a complexity economist. And so I like to find those interdependent, interconnected points. And one thing that Cecilia mentioned right now about youth, we always have this idea of youth mobilization and youth movements. We fail to recognize the ability we have to actually embed youth in decision-making. I was living in Norway for 15 years, and Scandinavians actually have youth on boards, youth in government in certain ways, right? There's a whole system there where intergenerationality is actually not perfect by any means. I'm not pointing to say it's perfect, but there's something there that already is something we can emulate easier, as in just saying about the movement, how do we not embed this? And yes, voting age, for example, is one thing, but even thinking a bit more bolder than that. Why does the Ontario legislature not think of maybe having a youth and diversity upper house, for example, a citizens assembly connected to our parliamentary systems? We invented parliamentary systems, right? People did, not nature. So we can reinvent them all we want and make them intergenerational. So that was one of the elements about, that I suggest going forward, is how do we actually embed youth in decision making, mainly because youth represent the future alive today. And so the best people to imagine in the freest way what that future could be and should be is actually going to be those living it here today, present, who are going to project it and emerge it from the future. The second area that I found fascinating was, so in your book, Seth, of course, you've mentioned it a few times, end of the Second World War, look how the world came together. And I think in that element, to me, there's also a very interesting kind of fact to look at, right? And that fact to me is diversity. So at the end of the war, there was actually a group that got together, right? For some of you, you might know, it's called Bretton Woods. It was a conference not too far from Toronto on the US side. It took 3 weeks and 700 people to institutionalize this entire system. And just to not point fingers and say these were evil people or whatever, they were well-intentioned, right? Let's have peace. Let's make sure we don't have another war. But the interesting fact about that is it was, again, one small subset of humanity, and actually half a subset because women weren't even there. And then that cultural framework is what institutionalized the system. There was no diversity. So if we look at a challenge like climate change and we try to solve it with one framework, it's basically like having one painter, a blank, or looking at a room of thousands of painters, picking only one, giving them one color to paint with, and then say, here's your blank canvas. Please paint to me the complexity of the world we live in, people and planet. Go. I'm sure they'll come up with a picture. They have. This is what we call the systems and economics that we live with today. But imagine what we can do if we allowed everybody to paint. If we replicated that same process that took just 3 weeks, except we embed all the diversity we have, geographic, age, intergenerational, culture, everything we have. There's 180 languages spoken alone in Toronto. That's an amazing thing that we can do if we look at climate change and embed all that diversity in there. The third piece that I found fascinating as well is we really still believe so much in this old World War II measure of success, right? Since the end of the Second World War, we've become so hooked on the idea, like Greta, paraphrasing Greta a little bit, we can grow our economies eternally, and that somehow that equates to a better life. But what growth are we actually talking about, right? So since the end of the war, we actually got addicted to something called gross domestic product. Don't really know what that actually does. We don't know how to compile. Not many people know how many Excel tables it takes to compile it. But in general term, it basically means how quickly you convert nature to money using the cheapest possible labor. That's the ultimate decision-making tool that we currently have in our societies globally, right? Nation down, our corporations follow the same algorithm, our countries, our provinces, our cities are victims of the algorithm. But that is the very simple, when people say it's really complicated, it actually isn't. That's the equation. So socially, this has resulted in so much entrenched injustice, inequalities, everything we see and we fight socially. But now imagine for a moment what that means from a climate change perspective. Not only did all the extractive, exploitative, and conquest-driven actions that cause climate change result in GDP growth, yay, we're doing better, GDP grew. But every time we have to pay to respond and spend money to respond to the effects of a change in climate, GDP grows as well. So you got those forest fires in Northern Ontario, or in this case, the West Coast, you got to pay to help to fix that, to fight that. That's GDP growth. You have floods in the Ottawa Valley, great, GDP is growing. So it's not an intentional, conscious thing. This is just a number, very far aggregated. And I'm not saying that literally people want more forest fires, but this is how policy is being driven. So basically in Ontario, we have the ability to decide if that's not good enough. What do we want to change? What do we want the purpose of an economy to be? Do we still want it to be how quickly do you convert nature to money using cheap labor? Or do we want that purpose to be something else, right? So that's one thing that we could look at. And maybe as a hypothetical in all that, imagine if I told you for a moment that the economy of Ontario over the last few years saw a 20% increase in the number of girls riding bikes to school. Would that tell you that there's something better about your society compared to 5% GDP growth? Just as a hypothetical. So think about it, and we don't have to discuss it now, but just reflect on what it would mean to even boost that number of girls riding bikes to school by a teeny tiny little bit in a city like Toronto or Ottawa or Mississauga or Burlington. Imagine the social and environmental implications needed for that. Is that a better representation of economy? So in conclusion, So our climate emergency, in a way, is a result of 2,000 years of Western elder masculine cultural worldview. And I'm not saying bad or good. Don't get me wrong. There's been a lot of good. There's progress. There's a lot of things that we, advances, technologies, breakthroughs. So it's not to point and say evil and bad, but maybe it's run its course, right? Maybe it's had its day. So this small subset of humanity on its own probably can't be expected to come up with the big, bold, transformative ideas that fall so far out its cultural frame of reference, right? So then Ontario, being home to so many painters from such a diversity of backgrounds and lived experiences and realities, painters who collectively could not only imagine better, but I'm sure could truly emerge in 3 weeks, a much better painting of our world and our economics. Thank you.
Thank you for all of that insight. That's terrific. So I'd like to open it up to folks at home who are watching online. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to share them. I do have one already that I'd like to share with the panelists. Amara, if you want to tackle this one perhaps, how can we be sure that community organization will result in progressive policy changes?
Good question. I can't think of, I was about to go real cliche there about a small organized group of people. I think that like there's so much that we can accomplish by having a clear goal in mind and a group of people who are ready to throw down around that goal. I think I was looking at the questions while we were listening to the other speakers as well, and somebody asked about how we can ensure that community organization doesn't result in strengthening the other side. And I spent a lot of time trying to organize the most strategic thing possible. I ran Lead Now's 2015 strategic voting campaign. So I'm like very comfortable with trying to figure out like the most strategic pathway. But I think that like without overthinking it, if you just let the fear fall away and you bring together people who believe in the same thing and who have a shared goal, and you put your energy towards that goal and towards focusing on roughly moving in the right direction, so much becomes possible and the noise falls away. So I think it looks like Seth has something to say too, that I think we just need to bring together people around a shared vision and stay focused on what it is that we're trying to do together.
Thanks for that. Seth, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I want to weigh in on this one and tie it back in actually to Amara's previous comments and to Cecilia's as well, and share a little story. I mean, so first of all, I would say the youth mobilization, whether it's the Our Time stuff that Amara has been part of leading and the student strike actions that Cecilia has been a part of, they've changed the political landscape in the country. They have changed the terrain. And the Indigenous land defense stuff has also shifted the terrain. And I see lots of people sharing in the comment about this Friday, the 25th, and the student mobilization happening, the youth mobilization happening again. But I want to offer a story from here in Vancouver that some of you folks all in Ontario might not be familiar with, around how that can work in a way that actually gets good outcomes to the question that's been asked. So as Amara mentioned, my partner is a Vancouver City Councillor here, Christine Boyle. And so she was the councillor who introduced Vancouver's climate emergency motion at the beginning of last year, the first in English Canada. Of course, Quebec was already doing it. But the Vancouver one set a bit of a pattern, and now we've seen dozens of them. Now, I don't expect people in Ontario to follow Vancouver city politics very closely, so let me just tell you that there is no political party that has a majority in Vancouver City Council. Chris is the only person from her party. You never know how a vote's going to go with this gang. Let me just tell you that. Now, when she brought the climate emergency motion, she didn't know how it would go. And it passed unanimously. And then it tasked the city with actually developing a plan that aligned with the IPCC in 3 months, which they did. And then I had to go back to council. And that plan, which is the most ambitious in North America, I believe, also passed unanimously. Even though, Cecilia raised the point about how climate has been weaponized politically, federally, and in so many provinces. And yet in Vancouver, across this diverse political spectrum, it was unanimous. How did that happen? Now, partly I would say, my wife's really good at her job. But what she would say is that it was the students. It was the climate strikers who rallied outside each time, who spoke in council, who filled the gallery each time those votes happened, and watched as those votes happened, and they made it politically impossible for people to vote no. And that's what we need to see more of across the country, I think.
Love that. What do you guys think about, and I'm throwing in my own question for fun here, the use of technology to sort of bring different generations together? Because I loved when that grandma got out there on TikTok and all the K-pop kids came and stopped everything from happening with the Trump rallies. Have you guys seen any technologies or tools that you think are particularly interesting for mobilizing or organizing today? Anybody want to take that one? Seth?
Oh, I think that's Amara's department.
Amara.
Well, I'm trying to think of the point I want to make here, because there is tons of cool technology out there. And it has been, in the early days of the pandemic, I spent so much time talking to organizers and activists who had to start campaigning digitally for the first time. Atia, actually, who is commenting in the chat, a few of us, including both of us from the 350 team, launched Ask a Digital Campaigner so that people could ask us questions about how to transition to mobilizing online. And so much is possible. You referenced the amazing TikTok, K-pop, Gen Z collaboration. But the thing about technology is that it's not a shortcut. And the thing that part of what we need to do in this crisis is bring public opinion on side. And that can only happen through conversations. So every time we talk about how cool the new tactics are, I always want to pull us back to what is really important in organizing, which is personal conversations between people to persuade them and change their minds. So my favorite examples of technology when used to power organizing are ones that enable people to have deep, authentic conversations about what's important to them.
Love that. Okay, I think we've got time for just one last question, and then just about a minute also for Seth to wrap up some final thoughts as well. But Cecilia, this question's for you. Given that young people are largely excluded from voting and therefore significant parts of the political process, what are your suggestions for youth who want to mobilize? Do you think lowering the voting age would give youth a seat at the table?
First of all, I do think lowering the voting age is something that should be considered. Quite frankly, as a climate activist and as a young person, I've met a lot of 16-year-olds who seem a lot more capable of participating in politics and assessing the needs for their own futures. I think especially talking about this in terms of a climate emergency, it's a big change, but it's one that I think makes a lot of sense. Like I said, it is our futures that are on the line. And so giving us a seat at the table and giving us a chance to participate in politics by voting seems like a fairly reasonable response. Besides voting, I always do like to bring it back to communities as well, bring it back to organizing with other young people, and then also creating areas to work with other generations as well. So working with people like Climate Strike Canada, with the Fridays for the Future movement, those are things that I've found a lot of hope in and a lot of place for young people to have a seat at the table. Also having conversations with your family, with people around you. I think showing people in general as young people that we're capable of having these conversations, that we're capable of holding our own when it comes to climate change is really important. This issue isn't being taken seriously, I think a large part because young people are the ones doing a lot of the talking. And so showing that we're capable of doing that is really important.
That's wonderful. And I saw somebody just share this earlier in the chat, so I just want to do a shout out because somebody started a group called Seniors for Climate Action. So if anybody wants to get involved with that, I love intergenerational and intragenerational mobilizing. Seth, I'm just going to pass it over to you, and thank you so much, Cecilia, for that. Do you want to just wrap up with some final thoughts here for us?
Sure, real quick, and then give Hadrian his chance. Thanks to all the panelists. I guess in closing, I would just say it's an emergency, and we need to be pressing for just a different level of ambition. Emergencies, as we've all experienced in this pandemic, need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. That's what I think we should be watching for in the throne speech, hopefully. And you know, I guess my closing message is that we need to make the most of this minority federal government moment, this pandemic moment, and what I think has to be a state-led recovery, this emergency moment, and to all sound the alarm. And now's the time to demand both our federal and provincial governments adopt a truly ambitious climate emergency plan and an audacious Green New Deal. You know, I think we can do so knowing from both our wartime experience and now our pandemic experience that when we adopt emergency mindsets, the scale and speed of what we can do is actually quite spectacular. This whole pandemic that we've been going through, in some ways, you know, we had so much momentum up to the end of last year with the student mobilizations and the Wet'suwet'en solidarity stuff. And the pandemic pushed some of that off the front burner, but only temporarily. I actually think as we emerge from this, it sets us up well. We've now seen what's possible. There's a new appreciation for the role of government and the importance of public service, the level of social solidarity and national cooperations at a generational high. There's new respect for science and the role of scientists. And there's fairly wide agreement that the recovery is going to have to be state-led. The point of debate is going to be, will it be state investment to rebuild the old, or will it catapult us into the new? And I guess my final comment for everyone wondering about, you know, our own individual roles in all of this, I'll just note something I note in the conclusion of the book, which is that, you know, few of us were alive in the Second World War who are on this call today, but a lot of us look back on pivotal times like that, and those of us with a nerdy interest in history, and we ask ourselves, you know, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? And the answer to that question is really no mystery. The answer to that question is whatever we're all each ready to do right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so very much, Seth, for taking all that time and energy, blood, sweat, and tears to write a terrific book that is going to be used and read by so many people. I want to plug it right here for you guys. I've got a copy. Make sure to pick up Seth's book. I want to thank all of our panelists, and a special thank you to everybody watching online. We've got one more person to speak, so please hang tight for a couple seconds. I hope that this has really just inspired you as much as it has inspired me. And I also very much hope that every elected official in Canada reads this book. So as we mentioned off the top, these book launches have been taking place across Canada, and they've been sponsored by a lot of people. But the offices of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, these people have been really leading a lot of the organizing. So I'd like to hand over the mic now to Adrian Mertens-Kirkwood, who's a CCPA climate researcher, and he's going to share some final remarks. Adrian?
Thank you. And thank you to everyone, all of our tonight's speakers, for making such a powerful case for what Seth has called a good war in this excellent new book. I also have my copy. I'm very excited about it. It's a daunting title, I know, but it reflects, I guess, the daunting challenge we face with climate change. And yet, I have to say, I'm very heartened by the book. I'm heartened by tonight's conversation. It's important for all of us to remember that a better world is possible, and that we can do something about it as individuals, as communities, and frankly, as Ontarians, we're in a very good position to lead the charge on making a lot of the changes we need to see. Now, at the CCPA, we've been grappling with a lot of these questions of how best to transition to a more just and sustainable world for a number of years now, many years. And in fact, I know that Seth's book builds on the decades of research and advocacy he did as the director of the CCPA's BC office. And although Seth has moved on to bigger things, big-time author now, the CCPA does continue to be at the forefront of the progressive climate policy conversation in Canada. And I just wanted to plug some of the cool work we're doing. Our longstanding climate justice project is highlighting the necessity of incorporating equity and social justice into climate policy. Our corporate mapping project is shining a light on corporate power in the fossil fuel industry. Our alternative federal budget is mapping out a comprehensive and economically viable path to a zero carbon future. And our trade and investment research project is figuring out how to make a Green New Deal a reality, not just in Canada, but around the world as well. So on the whole, the CCPA is committed to fighting for the better world that Seth has so effectively laid out in this book. And we really look forward to working with our partners, with our allies, with our supporters to continue to make that happen. And on that note, I should say that the work that we do only happens because of the support of people like you. So if you're not already a supporter of the CCPA, I encourage you to go to policyalternatives.ca and click donate. Your support really makes all the difference and allows us to do this very important work. So thank you again, everyone who participated today. Thank you to all the other sponsors and supporters of this event, to all our great speakers, and especially to Seth. Your insights, your leadership, they've never been more important than they are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as being the clock nerd that I am, the person who has to maintain time, we're at 8:31. I'm going to give us one more minute because it is most important to thank everybody. I want to thank you, Hadrian. Thanks to Erica, to Bronson, to Sarah, to Amara, Cecilia, Yannick, and of course, Seth for his contribution tonight. Thank you to the staff at ECW Press and Katie Razzo of the CCPA and everybody's hard work behind the scenes. Thanks as well to all of our sponsors. Most of all, thank all of you for coming and watching, everybody across Ontario. Rise, we've got a lot of work to do. I hope you leave this very inspired. Make sure to pick up the book. I'm Zaya Tong. Take care and good night.